The night her stepmother cut her hair, she thought it was over, then the Duke saw her. They said a woman's hair was her crown, so her stepmother took scissors to it at midnight, and smiled. Karen Briggs stood before the narrow mirror in her dressing room, a single tallow candle trembling in her grip. She did not scream. She did not weep. She simply looked. Where waves of dark hair had once fallen past her shoulders. Her mother's hair, everyone always said, the same warm brown, the same quiet dignity, there was now only jagged ruin. Uneven. Deliberate. The work of steady hands and a colder heart. Sienna had not done it in anger. That was the part Karen kept turning over in her mind. Even now, even as a tear tracked silently down her cheek and dropped onto the collar of her nightgown. Anger she could have understood. This was calculation. Her stepmother had stood over her in the dark of 3 a.m. with the dressmaking scissors and the focused patience of a woman pruning a garden, removing what threatened to bloom. Beside her, sleeping through it all in the adjoining room, was Ava, golden, poised, untouched. Sienna's true daughter. The one who was meant to shine at Duke Nolan Freeman's ball. Karen was never meant to shine. She was meant to be a contrast, a bruise beside a pearl, a before beside an after. If she appeared at all, she would appear ruined. And a ruined girl did the polite thing. A ruined girl stayed home. Karen set the candle down. She crossed to the cedar chest at the foot of her bed, the one Sienna had never thought to open, because it contained nothing worth taking, and lifted the lid. Beneath folded letters and a pressed flower turning to dust, she found it. Her mother's grey silk gown, for seasons out of fashion, smelling faintly of cedar and something older. Something hers. She held it against her chest and looked again at the mirror. The girl looking back at her had short, uneven hair and eyes still wet at the rims. She looked like someone who had been hurt. She looked like someone who had decided, very quietly, that she was not finished. Karen Briggs had spent years learning to want less space, less notice, less of everything, because wanting had always led to loss. Her mother was gone. Her father's warmth had followed him into whatever fog Sienna had drawn around him. Even her reflection had been something she had learned to pass without lingering. But Sienna had made a mistake tonight. She had turned Karen's disappearance into a choice. And Karen, for the first time in longer than she could remember, chose differently. She began to dress. Across the county, in the amber-lit ballroom of Freeman Hall, Duke Nolan Freeman stood at the edge of the room with a glass of claret he had not tasted, watching the door. He did not know why. He would not know, not until the door opened, and a young woman walked in alone, in grey silk that was not this season's and hair that was not this season's fashion either, with an expression on her face that was not performing a single thing, not beauty, not humility, not the careful hope he had watched 100 other girls arrange across their features like stage dressing. She simply walked in. And Duke Nolan Freeman, who had been told all his life what to notice and had spent the last 3 years noticing none of it, crossed the room. Welcome to Forbidden Diaries. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. Karen had known, even as she fastened the last hook of the grey gown, that Sienna would be watching for her absence. That was the cruelty of it. Her stepmother had not needed to lock a door or issue a command. She had simply expected that Karen, standing in the ruin of herself at 3 a.m, would do the sensible thing. The quiet thing. She would fold herself away like a letter that was never meant to be sent. Sienna did not know her as well as she believed. The gown fit differently than it would have fit her mother, a little looser at the waist, a little longer at the hem, but Karen did not mind. There was something steadying about it, like a hand placed gently between the shoulder blades. She smoothed the skirt once, pinned the only brooch she owned, a small pearl, her mother's, that Sienna had somehow missed, at her collar, and turned away from the mirror before doubt could find her again. The walk to Freeman Hall was 20 minutes through air that smelled of October and dying leaves. She had no carriage. She had not expected one. She arrived on foot, alone, with mud at the hem of the grey silk and her short hair curling slightly at the ears in the cold, and she stood for a moment at the bottom of the stone steps listening to the music pouring out from within, warm and bright and entirely indifferent to her. She climbed the steps. The footman at the door looked at her the way people had been looking at her all her life, briefly, and then away. She gave her name. He checked it against his list. Her father's name was on it, which meant hers was too, which was the one thing Sienna had not thought to revoke, and he stood aside. The ballroom hit her like a held breath released all at once. Candlelight, crystal, the low roar of 100 conversations folded inside music. Silk in every color except grey. Hair dressed high and powdered and pinned with jewels that caught the chandeliers and threw light like accusations. Every woman in the room looked finished. Assembled. Correct. Karen stood in the doorway in her dead mother's dress with her ruined hair and her muddy hem, and for one terrible moment the old instinct rose in her chest. Turn around, go back, want less, and she felt the full weight of every year she had spent making herself small enough to be tolerated. She let the instinct pass through her. Then she stepped inside. No one parted for her. No one rushed to greet her. The room continued its bright, indifferent roar, and Karen moved through it quietly, like a grey thread pulled through gold cloth, and if her heart was hammering beneath her mother's brooch, there was no one close enough to know it. She had come. That was enough. For now, it was enough. She had been inside the ballroom for perhaps 10 minutes before the whispers started. Karen heard them the way one hears rain beginning, not all at once, but in increments, a murmur here, a tilted head there, a fan raised just high enough to shield a mouth already curving. She caught fragments without trying. The Briggs girl. Did you see? Yes, her hair, look at it. What on earth happened? Poor creature. Does she not own a mirror? A woman in rose taffeta touched her own elaborate coiffure as Karen passed, the gesture unconscious and therefore more honest than anything said aloud. Karen kept walking. She found a position near the far wall, beside a column wreathed in hothouse flowers, and stood with her hands folded and her chin level. She was not performing ease. She simply refused to perform distress, which was the only dignity left to her, and she held it the way one holds a candle in wind, carefully, with both hands, without looking at the flame. She did not see him watching. Duke Nolan Freeman had spent the better part of the evening doing what was required of him, greeting, nodding, saying the correct thing to the correct people in the correct order. He was good at it in the way that men trained from boyhood to be good at things they do not particularly enjoy are good at them, competently, and with nothing behind the eyes. His title filled the room before he entered it. Women arranged themselves differently when he passed. Men straightened. He had long since stopped finding either of these things interesting. Then the door had opened, and she had walked in. He had noticed her immediately, which surprised him, because there was nothing about her that announced itself. No jewels. No elaborate hair. No entrance calculated to draw the eye. She had simply appeared, grey silk, bare neck, that short uneven hair that the room was now quietly shredding, and something in the quality of her stillness had snagged his attention and refused to release it. He watched her cross the room. He watched her find the column and stand beside it. He watched the rose taffeta woman touch her own hair, and he watched Karen notice, and he watched Karen choose not to flinch. That was the thing. That was precisely the thing he could not look away from. Every other woman in the room wanted something from this evening, a match, an introduction, a favorable report carried back to a mother waiting at home. He did not blame them for it. The wanting was reasonable, the world having been arranged to make it so. But the wanting was always visible, a shimmer beneath the surface of every smile, and he had grown so tired of seeing it. This woman wanted nothing from him. She did not even know he was looking. He set down his untasted claret on the tray of a passing footman, straightened his coat once, and began to move through the crowd. She heard him before she saw him. Or rather, she heard the change in the room around her, that subtle shift in atmosphere that preceded a person of consequence the way a drop in temperature precedes a storm. Conversations nearby lost their thread. A small, instinctive realignment happened, shoulders turning, chins lifting, and Karen followed none of it because she had trained herself not to track the movements of rooms. She had always found it safer not to want what rooms contained. Then he was simply there, beside the column, looking at her directly. "Miss Briggs." He said it without preamble, without the elaborate scaffolding of compliment most men constructed before making a request, as though they were afraid of the request itself. "Will you dance?" Karen looked at him for a moment. The Duke of Freeman, in the flesh, was less theatrical than his reputation. No performance of charm, no practiced smile deployed at the correct angle. He was watching her with an expression she could not immediately categorize, which unsettled her more than arrogance would have. "I will," she said, because she had already decided tonight that she was done refusing herself things. He danced well, which she had not expected to notice, and yet she noticed it the way one notices unexpectedly good light, without meaning to, with something close to gratitude. He did not fill the silence with noise. He did not look at her hair the way the room had looked at her hair, as though it were an embarrassment requiring acknowledgement or careful avoidance. He simply looked at her face, with that same unclassifiable expression, and when the music ended he did not release her hand. The pause lasted exactly long enough for the room to register it. "Again," he said. It was not quite a question. Karen understood, in that instant, precisely what he was doing. One dance was courtesy. 2 consecutive dances was a declaration written in plain sight for every person in the ballroom to read, and every person in the ballroom knew how to read it. She felt the room go still around them in the particular way of rooms that are pretending not to pay attention. "You understand what that will suggest," she said quietly. "Yes," said the Duke, without hesitation and without apology. She searched his face for the performance, the angle, the strategy, the thing beneath the thing, and found nothing she could name except a steadiness that reminded her, without logic, of a mother's grey gown. Something worn with intention. Something chosen. "Then yes," she said. Again. They danced a second time. Across the ballroom, behind a pillar wreathed in the same hothouse flowers Karen had stood beside not an hour ago, Sienna watched with a stillness that had curdled into something she would not yet call fear. She had planned for Karen's absence. She had not planned for this. Her fan moved once, twice, and then stopped, held motionless in a grip just slightly too tight. She was thinking. Karen could feel it from across the room. Good, she thought, and followed the Duke's lead into the turn. Sienna moved through the ballroom the way she always moved through difficult situations, with a smile so composed it could have been painted on, and a destination no one watching would have thought to find suspicious. She paused to compliment a necklace here, to laugh at something forgettable there, building the small social currency she had spent 20 years accumulating, and then she spent it all in one place. The Duchess of Freeman was 60, sharp-eyed, and widely understood to be the true architecture behind her son's marital prospects. She sat near the east window in a chair that had been quietly arranged to function as a throne, receiving visitors with the particular graciousness of women who have never needed to seek attention because attention has always known where to find them. Sienna approached with her most elegant curtsy and her most sorrowful expression, which she had also spent 20 years perfecting. "Your Grace." She settled beside the Duchess with the careful intimacy of a woman sharing something she would rather not share. "I wonder if I might speak frankly, out of regard for your family." The Duchess regarded her with eyes that had seen a great deal and forgotten very little. "Speak," she said. What followed was not a lie, exactly. Sienna was too skilled for lies, which were fragile things that shattered under examination. What she offered instead was an architecture of suggestion, true stones mortared together with false intention. She spoke of Karen's mother, gently, sorrowfully, as a woman whose nerves had been fragile. She spoke of Karen herself with an expression of pained concern, the expression of a stepmother who had tried and found the situation beyond her. She used words like episodes and unpredictable and "we've been so worried," each one placed with the precision of someone who understood that the most effective poison has no taste. She did not accuse. She only wondered, aloud and sadly, whether the stress of an elevated match might prove too great a burden for a girl of Karen's particular disposition. The Duchess listened without interruption, which Sienna took for receptivity, because she was accustomed to being received. She did not notice, could not have known to look for it, the exact moment the Duchess's expression moved from polite attention to something quieter and more dangerous. Something that was not persuasion but its opposite, hardening behind the eyes like water becoming ice. "How very concerned you are," the Duchess said, when Sienna had finished, "for a girl you brought to a ball in her dead mother's dress." The silence that followed was brief and absolute. Sienna recovered quickly, she always did, and made her exit with grace, her smile intact, her spine straight, betraying nothing. But as she moved back into the warm noise of the ballroom, her mind was working furiously beneath the composed surface, recalculating, and somewhere underneath even that, in a place she did not examine, something that felt uncomfortably like dread had begun to stir. The summons came in the form of a folded note, delivered by an elderly maid Karen did not recognize, pressed into her hand between the second dance and the supper hour with the quiet efficiency of someone who had delivered private correspondence for decades and understood that its value lay precisely in its discretion. Karen unfolded it behind the column that had become, by accident, her refuge for the evening. The library. Third door on the left. Come alone. F. She might have hesitated. A month ago, a year ago, the version of herself that had spent years making herself smaller would have hesitated, turned the note over looking for reasons not to go, found them easily and been relieved. But that version of herself had stood in a narrow mirror at 3 a.m. and made a different decision, and so Karen folded the note, tucked it into her glove, and went. The library was everything the ballroom was not: dark, still, smelling of old leather and cold hearth, the noise of the party reduced to something distant and irrelevant. A single lamp burned on the writing desk, and beside it sat a woman of perhaps 70, white-haired and upright, with the particular stillness of people who have long since stopped needing to prove anything to any room. "You look like her," the woman said, by way of greeting. "Sit down, Karen." Lady Freya had been her mother's closest friend in the years before the marriage, before Sienna, before everything contracted into its present diminished shape. Karen knew the name the way one knows the names in old letters, distantly, with a faint warmth, like sunlight through winter glass. She Saturday. What Lady Freya told her next she received in silence, because the words required space that speech would have crowded. Her mother had known she was dying. Not suddenly, not at the end, but with the quiet foreknowledge of women who pay attention to their own bodies and are not frightened by what they find there. She had known, and she had acted, in the methodical and loving way that had apparently characterized everything she did. She had gone to Lady Freya. Lady Freya had gone to the late Duke of Freeman, an old friend and a man of his word. Together, the three of them had drawn up an agreement, not a betrothal, nothing so presumptuous, but a safeguard. A legal recognition that Karen Briggs, upon reaching adulthood, held a prior claim to a portion of her father's estate that no subsequent marriage could extinguish, and further, that the Freeman family stood as witness and guarantor of that claim. Sienna had known about the agreement. Lady Freya said this plainly, without softening it. She had found the document in the first year of her marriage and had done what she always did with things that threatened her. She had buried it, quietly, where she believed it would never surface. She miscalculated, said Lady Freya, and placed the document on the desk between them. One friend. She sat with the document in her hands for a long time after Lady Freya fell silent, not reading it. She had read it twice already, carefully, the way one reads something that rearranges the furniture of an entire life, but simply holding it, feeling the weight of paper that had existed all along while she had been busy learning to need less. Her mother had known, had planned, had loved her with a practicality so quiet and so thorough that it had survived death itself, outlasted grief, outlasted Sienna's careful excavations, and arrived here, on a library desk, in the middle of a ball Karen had nearly not attended. She thought about Sienna differently now, and the thinking was not kind but it was clear, which was its own relief. She had spent years arranging her stepmother in her mind as a species of casual cruelty. A woman who diminished her because diminishing was simply her nature, the way certain soils will not sustain certain flowers. But sitting in the lamplight with the document between her fingers, Karen understood that she had given Sienna too little credit and herself too little significance. Sienna had been afraid of her. Had always been afraid of her. Every cold word, every engineered invisibility, the surgical patience of the midnight scissors, none of it was casual. It was the sustained, exhausting labor of a woman who understood exactly what Karen represented and had devoted years to ensuring Karen never understood it herself. The cruelty had been a form of terror. And terror, Karen thought, implied something worth being terrified of. She folded the document and placed it inside her glove beside the note, feeling it press warm against her wrist like a second pulse, and she thanked Lady Freya with words that were insufficient and eyes that were not, and she walked back out into the corridor. The noise of the ballroom found her again, that bright indifferent roar, and she stood in it for a moment and took stock of herself honestly. Her hem was still muddy. Her hair was still uneven. She was still without a carriage and without an ally in any room except an elderly woman who smelled of lavender and kept secrets like pressed flowers, flat and perfectly preserved. And yet, she had danced twice with a duke who had not looked at her hair once, who had said again without hesitation and without apology, who had looked at her the way people look at things they are not yet ready to name but are also not willing to look away from. She had spent so long wanting less that she had forgotten wanting itself was not the dangerous thing. The dangerous thing was wanting without knowledge of your own worth. She had the knowledge now, legal and witnessed and folded against her wrist. She smoothed her grey skirt once, lifted her chin to its level position, and went to find the Duke. She found him at the edge of the supper room, in conversation with two men whose names she did not know, and she did not interrupt. She simply positioned herself where he would see her when he turned, which he did, within moments, as though some peripheral sense had been quietly tracking her all evening. He excused himself without apparent reluctance and crossed to her, and she told him, briefly and plainly, what Lady Freya had shown her. He listened the way he had danced, without filling the space unnecessarily, without performing a reaction before he had finished forming one. When she finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I know about the agreement." And the words landed with a weight that told her he had known for longer than tonight. He had been waiting, he explained, with the same plainness she had used, for Karen herself to know. Lady Freya had written to him 3 weeks prior. He had attended his own ball with a specific and patient intention, and then a woman in grey silk had walked through the door and made patience feel both easier and considerably more difficult simultaneously. Karen absorbed this and found she was not angry at the withholding. She understood the shape of it. He had not wanted to come to her as a man executing a plan. He had wanted to know who she was first. She respected that, which she had not expected to feel in addition to everything else she was currently feeling. "Then you know what she did," Karen said. "Sienna." "I know enough," he said. "I intend to know the rest of it publicly." She watched him find her stepmother across the room with the calm, specific focus of a man who has decided something and is simply locating the beginning of it, and she felt, for the first time all evening, something loosen in her chest. What followed was not theatrical. That was the thing she would remember afterward, when she turned the evening over in her mind the way one turns a stone to see what lives beneath. It was not theatrical at all. The Duke approached Sienna in the supper room with perfect courtesy and the quiet devastation of a man who speaks precisely and selects his words the way a surgeon selects instruments. He mentioned the agreement. He mentioned Lady Freya. He mentioned, with particular and unhurried clarity, the legal implications of a document suppressed, and the social implications of its suppression becoming known. Sienna's composure did not shatter. It was too well built for that. But it cracked, fine lines running through it like frost across glass, and her eyes moved once, involuntarily, to Karen standing several feet away, and what lived in that glance was not hatred, though hatred was present. It was the look of a woman confronting the precise miscalculation that has undone her. She had cut Karen's hair to erase her. Instead, she had made her impossible to forget. The ball ended the way grand things often do, not all at once, but in a slow recession, the music softening, the candles burning lower, the bright roar of the room thinning to clusters of conversation and then to coats being retrieved and carriages called. Karen moved through it quietly, as she had moved through most of the evening, except that she was not the same person who had entered. The Duke offered her his carriage. She accepted, because she had also decided tonight that she was done refusing herself practical things, and the alternative was 20 minutes through October dark with a muddier hem than she had arrived with. They did not speak much during the ride. The silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not require filling, and Karen looked out at the passing dark and felt the document press against her wrist and thought about her mother with a grief that had changed its quality, softer now, and threaded through with something that felt almost like gratitude. The carriage stopped before the Briggs house. It was dark, which meant Sienna had not yet returned, or had returned and retired, and either way the hallway would be empty. The Duke stepped out first and handed her down, and then, instead of returning to the carriage, he followed her to the door. She turned to look at him. "I won't keep you long," he said, which struck her as a remarkable thing for a man in his position to say, because men in his position were accustomed to keeping people as long as they wished. I have no speech prepared. I decided against one on the way here. Good, said Karen. I would have found it suspicious. Something moved briefly across his face that might, in better light, have been the beginning of a smile. He reached into his coat and produced a ring, small, simply set, a dark stone she could not name in the dimness, and held it in his palm without yet offering it, as though he wanted to explain it before she was asked to decide anything about it. It had belonged, he told her, to his father's mother. It had been given to Lady Freya for safekeeping at the time of the agreement, with the instruction that it be passed to Karen Briggs when she was of age, as a token of the Freeman family's commitment to honouring what had been promised. Lady Freya had given it to him 3 weeks ago. He had been carrying it since. Karen looked at the ring in his palm and thought about her mother sitting across a desk from 2 old friends, making careful arrangements for a future she would not live to see, loving her daughter in the most practical and permanent way available to her. This was always meant to find you, the Duke said quietly. I'm only the final leg of a very long errand. She took the ring. Then she took his hand around it. Yes, she said. There was nothing theatrical in it, and it was exactly enough. 2 years is enough time for the world to forget why it started doing something. By the second autumn of Karen's marriage, the fashion papers were calling it the Freeman crop, that close-cut, deliberately unadorned style that had swept through London drawing rooms with the speed of things that feel, once seen, entirely inevitable. Ladies who had never once considered parting with their elaborate arrangements were sitting before their mirrors instructing their maids with a new and liberated firmness. Jewellers had pivoted to earrings. Milliners had adapted. The thing that had been done to Karen in the dark of a September midnight had become, by some alchemy she still found privately astonishing, the most copied silhouette in 3 counties. She thought about this sometimes, in the way one thinks about things that contain too much irony to be examined directly, sideways, and briefly, before moving on. This particular morning she was in the east sitting room of Freeman Hall with the windows open to the garden and a letter in her lap she had not yet finished reading, because the light was very good and the garden smelled of late roses, and she had learned, in 2 years of being a duchess, that the particular luxury of the position was not the house or the title or even the security, though the security was considerable and she did not take it lightly. The luxury was this: the permission to sit in good light for a moment longer than strictly necessary and simply exist in it without apology. She had been a long time learning to do that without flinching. The letter was from Lady Freya, who wrote monthly with the faithful irregularity of someone who has much to say and has earned the right to say it at whatever length she chooses. This one contained, near the bottom, a postscript that had made Karen set the letter down and look at the garden for a while. Your stepmother has left the county, Lady Freya wrote, with the brisk neutrality of someone conveying a weather report. I thought you would want to know, and I thought you would want to know I do not think she will return. Karen read it again, and then folded the letter along its creases. She did not feel what she might once have expected to feel. No triumph, no residual bitterness, none of the satisfaction she had perhaps imagined, in darker moments, vindication would deliver. What she felt was something quieter and more complete. The sensation of a door closing on a room she had already left. Sienna had taken scissors to her in the dark and called it strategy. She had been right, in her way, it had been strategic, simply not in the direction she intended. Every calculated diminishment, every engineered invisibility, every cold and patient cruelty had been aimed at making Karen forgettable. She touched the dark stone at her finger briefly, thought of her mother's grey silk, and returned to Lady Freya's letter. Outside, London was full of women with short hair, and not one of them knew why. If Karen's story moved you, if you felt every stolen dance, every whispered slight, every quiet act of defiance, then you already know this kind of story deserves to be found by someone else who needs it tonight. Like this video. Subscribe if you haven't already. And turn on the notification bell, so the next time we tell a story about a woman who refused to disappear, you'll be the first to know. We'll see you in the next one.